It started with a glance and ended with words I'll never forget. You've got that energy that's hard to ignore. It started as a weekend that was supposed to feel ordinary. One of those family get-togethers you agree to because you know it matters to someone you care about. For me, that someone was Maya, my girlfriend. She'd been talking about this trip for weeks. Her mom's birthday, the lake house, the cousins, the laughter, the food. The kind of thing where everyone knew everyone, and I was the new face in the mix. The drive out there was quiet. Autumn had started to take over the trees, turning the highway into a blur of gold and rust. By the time we pulled up, the sun was low, throwing that honey-colored light across the water. The house was alive. Voices spilling from the porch, music somewhere inside, the smell of something cooking. I told myself to relax, to fit in, to make a good impression. And I did, at least until she walked in. Her aunt, Renee. The name rolled off everyone's tongue easily, like they were used to it being said with a kind of affection. She wasn't loud or trying to stand out. But the moment she stepped into the room, people noticed. She had that kind of quiet presence, the kind that doesn't demand attention but still gets it. Mid-40s maybe, graceful, the kind of beauty that's more about confidence than appearance. Her hair framed her face softly, her expression calm but sharp, like she saw more than she let on. She smiled when we were introduced, her handshake firm, her eyes steady. "So you're the young man everyone's been curious about," she said, her tone playful but grounded. I smiled back, a little unsure what to say, but her energy was easy to be around, warm, self-assured, maybe even familiar somehow. The evening moved the way family nights do, laughter, stories, teasing. But I found myself aware of her without meaning to be. The sound of her laugh carried softly over the room. When she spoke, people listened. When she looked at someone, she really looked, the kind of gaze that felt like it could read intention. Later, when I stepped out onto the back deck to catch some air, she was already there. A glass of red wine in her hand, the glow of the porch light brushing her shoulder. She didn't say anything at first, just glanced over with a small smile, like she knew exactly what I was thinking. That sometimes quiet feels better than conversation. We talked briefly about the lake, the weather, nothing that meant anything. But it was in her tone, in the calm way she spoke, that something unspoken began to stir. A kind of intrigue I didn't have a name for. When I went back inside, Maya called me over, and I returned to the noise and warmth of the family. But even as I laughed and nodded through small talk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something subtle had shifted, like a thread had quietly been pulled loose between two people who weren't supposed to notice each other that way. The morning after the family gathering felt different. The sun filtered through the windows in long golden stripes, warming the wooden floors and filling the kitchen with a gentle glow. I had volunteered, or maybe I'd been volunteered, to help with breakfast. Pancakes, scrambled eggs, coffee brewing strong in the pot, the faint smell of cinnamon and toasted bread. The kitchen buzzed with casual conversation, the hum of movement, the occasional clatter of dishes. And then she appeared, Renee, calm, poised, like she had just stepped out of a painting that didn't quite belong in the chaos of a busy kitchen. Her sleeves were rolled up neatly, her hair loosely tied back, a few stray curls brushing her neck. She moved with effortless grace, reaching for ingredients, arranging plates, chatting softly with Maya's younger cousins. I tried to focus on the pancakes, flipping them carefully so they didn't burn. But I kept noticing her. The way she tilted her head slightly when listening, the subtle arch of her brow, the gentle curve of her lips as she smiled without really smiling. Something about her presence made the kitchen feel warmer, quieter, like the world outside had slowed down. We started talking lightly, casually. Music, recent trips, little observations about the house and the lake. I found myself laughing more than I expected, my guard lowering naturally. And then she said it, softly, almost like a comment not meant to linger, but somehow it did. "You've got that energy that's hard to ignore." The words caught me off guard. Not because they were flirtatious, She wasn't flirting. But because they felt deliberate, like a quiet acknowledgement of something in me I hadn't realized was noticeable. I laughed, brushing it off awkwardly, but she didn't look away. Her gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary, warm, steady, as if she were reading more than the words she spoke. There was a rhythm to it. A pause, a tilt of the head, the subtle lift of her eyebrow, that made the air between us heavier, charged. I handed her a plate of pancakes, and our fingers brushed. Just briefly, just a spark, but enough to make me aware of the distance our hands had traveled in that moment. Neither of us moved away immediately. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed down to that touch, the hum of the kitchen fading into the background. The rest of breakfast passed in ordinary ways, but I found myself stealing glances at her whenever I could. She laughed at something the kids said, leaned forward slightly over the table, the sunlight catching in her hair. Every movement felt deliberate, magnetic, but natural, like she was part of the room and yet apart from it at the same time. By the time I cleared the last plate, I knew that this wasn't going to be a simple weekend. Something had shifted, quiet, unspoken, but undeniable. And for the first time, I realized that the family trip I'd expected to be casual had just turned into something I couldn't ignore either. That evening, the house slowed down. The sun had set, leaving the lake outside dark and reflective. The sky streaked with deep purple and orange. The cousins and younger family members were scattered across the rooms, some dozing in front of the TV, others curled up with phones or books. The hum of conversation had softened to occasional laughter and the clink of glasses, leaving pockets of calm in between. I found myself drawn to the fire pit outside, the warmth of the flames pulling me out of the house and into the quiet night. I expected to be alone, but she was already there, seated on the edge of the bench, her legs tucked beneath her, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The firelight caught in her hair, highlighting the subtle streaks of gray that only added to her quiet elegance. We didn't speak immediately. We just sat, the crackle of the fire and the occasional splash of water against the dock filling the silence. There was no awkwardness, only a sense of recognition, as if two people had found a shared space in a world that otherwise demanded noise. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and reflective. "It's funny," she said, "how people notice you sometimes before you notice them. Or maybe it's just that some people are harder to ignore." Her eyes met mine, steady but not demanding, and I realized she wasn't talking about me. At least, not exactly. I smiled, trying to find the right words. "I think it depends on who's paying attention. Sometimes, it's easier to be seen by someone who isn't expecting anything from you." She tilted her head slightly, studying me with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously exposed and understood. "Maybe that's why I notice people who are still figuring themselves out," she said. Her tone was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, an acknowledgement of the vulnerability in growth, the beauty in discovery. We talked then, quietly, about life, about the moments that leave marks, about people who change us without even realizing it. It wasn't flirtation, at least not in the obvious sense. It was something more profound, the kind of connection that forms when two people recognize a familiar rhythm in each other, a resonance that doesn't need to be named. At one point, she laughed softly at something I said, and for a moment, I caught myself staring, memorizing the curve of her smile, the way her eyes sparkled in the firelight. She noticed, and our eyes met, holding the unspoken tension. A recognition that this weekend was slowly becoming something neither of us had anticipated. The night deepened, and the rest of the family's laughter faded. We stayed there, side by side, listening to the quiet lapping of the water, the wind rustling the trees. In that silence, I realized that it wasn't just her presence I was drawn to. It was the way she made me feel noticed, understood, and unexpectedly at ease. By the time we rejoined the others inside, something had shifted. The spark from the kitchen had grown into a subtle awareness, a quiet tension that neither of us tried to define yet. And I knew, even as I smiled and joined the chatter, that this weekend was no longer just about family. It was about her. The next morning, the rain had come unexpectedly, tapping steadily against the large windows of the lake house. Outside, the world was muted, blurred by water and gray skies. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the smell of fresh coffee and damp earth drifting in from the porch. The family had scattered, some watching TV, others reading or lounging quietly. The house felt like a bubble, cocooned against the storm outside. I found her in the living room, seated on the window bench with her legs tucked beneath her, a book resting on her lap. The soft light from the overcast morning illuminated her face, and her expression was one of calm focus. She glanced up as I entered, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I joined her, claiming a seat nearby with a mug of steaming coffee in hand. Conversation started casually. Comments on the rain, the lake's reflection, the comfort of being inside. But there was a quiet electricity in the space between us. Every so often, our hands brushed as I passed her the sugar, the touch lingering just a second too long. Neither of us moved away immediately. The moment felt suspended, delicate and charged, as if we were both aware of the tension but unwilling to name it. Her voice broke the silence again, gentle and probing. "Do you always notice people like that?" she asked, her gaze steady and curious. "I mean, people's energy, the way they move, the little things others overlook." I laughed softly, shaking my head, unsure of how to answer honestly. "Maybe," I admitted, "or maybe I just notice people I don't expect to forget." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, everything else, the rain, the house, the distant hum of conversation, faded. It was just us, two people in an unexpected stillness, sharing something private that neither dared to define aloud. Then it happened, the subtle, fleeting contact that sent a jolt through me. I leaned slightly to hand her a napkin, and our fingers brushed, lingering for a heartbeat that stretched impossibly long. She didn't pull away. I didn't either. It wasn't deliberate, but in that instant, I felt the gravity of the unspoken tension between us. She laughed softly, shaking her head as if to dispel the charged moment. "You make it too easy to forget who's supposed to be noticing who," she said, her words playful but tinged with something more. An acknowledgement of the connection neither of us was ready to name. The rain continued outside, and we sat together, side by side, sharing quiet conversation punctuated by pauses that were louder than words. Every glance, every slight movement, seemed to carry meaning, and the space between us grew intimate without ever needing to cross a boundary. By the time the storm eased, the subtle electricity remained, unspoken but undeniable, and I realized, as I watched her tuck a stray curl behind her ear and smile softly at something I said, that this weekend, which had begun as a simple family visit, was evolving into a delicate, complicated connection I hadn't expected and might never be able to ignore. After the storm passed, the air outside was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and pine. Inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just the rain that had washed away the morning's warmth. It was the unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed between us. There was an awareness now, a quiet tension, that neither of us dared to name. We both tried to maintain distance, subtle but deliberate. I stayed with the younger cousins during board games and card battles, laughing and engaging with the group, while she wandered through the rooms, tidying, reading, offering quiet guidance to anyone who needed it. But the absence of each other felt heavier than our presence had. I caught glimpses of her from across the room, the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the thoughtful tilt of her head, the soft smile that appeared when she thought no one was watching. At dinner, the tension became almost tangible. The room buzzed with conversation, laughter, and clinking glasses, but every so often, our eyes met across the table. A brief flash, a flicker of recognition that held longer than propriety allowed. We spoke in polite exchanges, avoiding anything too personal. Yet every word carried a subtle weight. Every glance lingered a moment too long. Later, I stepped outside to clear my head. The evening air was cool, and the lake stretched out silently before me, reflecting the stars in a perfect, still mirror. I hadn't expected her to join me. And yet, there she was, standing just a few feet away, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She didn't speak at first, simply watching the water with me, her presence close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and careful. "We should be careful," she said. There was a weight behind the words, a mix of acknowledgement and restraint. "You're not the kind of man people forget easily." I turned to face her, feeling the pull in my chest that had been growing since our first moments together. "And you," I said softly, "you're not the kind of woman anyone really stops thinking about." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, the world around us fell away. No family, no expectations, no rules. Just the two of us, standing in quiet acknowledgement of the tension that had been building all weekend. But neither of us moved closer, and neither of us crossed a line. There was a mutual understanding that some connections, no matter how magnetic, required patience, respect, and caution. We stood there for a while longer, the night stretching on, unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't frustration, exactly, but a bittersweet ache. The knowledge that something significant had started, yet could not be fully embraced, at least not yet. By the time we returned inside, the unspoken understanding lingered. The attraction, the connection, the awareness of each other, all had grown more intense. But it was tempered by restraint, by the recognition that some moments are meant to be savored in silence, rather than acted upon recklessly. And I realized that the most powerful emotions are often the ones left unspoken, felt more deeply because they are held in careful balance. The weekend ended faster than I'd realized. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the horizon, spilling warm gold across the lake and the surrounding trees. Bags were packed, suitcases lined up neatly by the door, and everyone moved through the house with the polite busyness of departures. Goodbyes were said with laughter, promises to call, and last-minute hugs, but none of it touched the quiet gravity I felt in my chest. I found her in the kitchen, the very place where our subtle connection had first sparked. She was pouring herself a final cup of coffee, the faint aroma of roasted beans mixing with the lingering scent of vanilla from the candles on the counter. She turned when she heard me enter, offering that soft, knowing smile that had become so familiar over the past days. "Leaving so soon?" I asked, my voice attempting casual warmth but failing to mask the hesitation beneath. She shrugged lightly, tilting her head. "All good things must come to an end," she said, but her eyes held something unspoken, a mixture of restraint, acknowledgement, and a quiet sadness. I stepped closer, our conversation slowing into a gentle rhythm, careful not to break the line we both knew was drawn. I wanted to thank you," I said, voice low, "for all of this, for talking with me, listening, noticing. It meant more than I expected." Her smile softened further. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and, almost instinctively, reached out to adjust the collar of my jacket. Her fingers lingered against my shoulder, a simple touch that carried a weight words could never hold. "You reminded me," she said, "that connection doesn't always ask permission. Sometimes it just happens. And that's okay." I swallowed, feeling a tug at my chest that had nothing to do with the rain outside or the smell of coffee. It was the gravity of what we had shared, the tension, the quiet intimacy that had grown over the weekend. "I'll remember this," I said softly. "You've made it unforgettable." She stepped closer, just a fraction, her warmth brushing against me in that delicate, fleeting way that felt both safe and electric. "Take care of that energy," she whispered, almost conspiratorially, her eyes glinting with warmth and something deeper. It changes rooms and people. I nodded, memorizing the moment. The soft press of her fingers, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes seemed to see straight through me. Words weren't necessary. Everything we hadn't said, everything lingering between us was already understood. As I turned to leave, I caught one last glance at her. Her posture relaxed, but her gaze lingered, following me with a gentle intensity that I knew I would carry long after the weekend ended. It wasn't a goodbye in the final sense. It was a promise, a memory, a quiet acknowledgement of a bond that had formed quietly, fiercely, and beautifully in the spaces between words and gestures. Walking out to the car, I realized that some connections are never just fleeting. They linger, shaping you, teaching you about what it means to be truly seen, even if that seeing can't always be acted upon. And in that moment, I knew this weekend, this woman, would stay with me forever. The drive home felt strange. The roads were empty, the world quiet, as if it too were giving me time to process the weekend. Maya had dozed off beside me, her head leaning lightly against the window, oblivious to the undercurrent that had woven itself quietly but firmly through the days we'd spent together. I watched the scenery slip past, trees dusted in early autumn light, the distant glint of water, and I realized I was remembering more than the weekend's events. I was remembering her, not just her face or the way she moved, though those were unforgettable. It was the way she made me feel seen, noticed, understood. The kind of attention that isn't loud or dramatic, but deliberate, quiet, and somehow transformative. Every glance, every smile, every subtle touch felt layered with meaning. And yet, it had all remained contained, respectful, and painfully beautiful because it existed in the space between words. Back in my apartment, the hum of daily life began again. Work emails, texts, the routine rhythm of city living. But even in the mundane, the memories followed me. The scent of her coffee, the warmth of her hand brushing mine, the way she had said, "You've got that energy that's hard to ignore." I realized that not every connection demands action. Some exist simply to awaken something inside you, to make you more aware of who you are and what you notice in others. I found myself replaying moments over and over. The shared silences by the fire pit, the rain tapping against the windows, our fingers brushing over the mug of tea. Each memory carried weight, as if the weekend had compressed weeks of intimacy into days. And yet, there had been no declaration, no surrender to the pull between us, only the recognition of it, which made it all the more vivid and lasting. It struck me that sometimes the people we encounter leave a mark not because of what we did together, but because of what they revealed about ourselves. Renee had reminded me that connection isn't always about possession or fulfillment. It's about presence, acknowledgement, and resonance. She had seen me, and in doing so had allowed me to see myself in a new light. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel longing in the desperate sense. I felt gratitude and awe. Some experiences are meant to be cherished, not claimed. Some people arrive in your life to teach you about depth, attention, and the beauty of restraint. And Renee had done all of that, quietly, without fanfare. As I leaned back, letting the city hum around me, I smiled faintly, thinking of her one last time. She taught me that attraction isn't always about wanting someone. Sometimes it's about finally being seen. That understanding, I realized, would stay with me, shaping the way I approached people, relationships, and even myself. The weekend had ended, but the impression remained. It was permanent, gentle, and luminous. A memory of what it feels like to connect so fully with another human being that their presence lingers long after they're gone. And in that lingering, I found a quiet sense of completeness, a lesson in love, patience, and the quiet power of being truly noticed. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe, and share in the comments the moments that have quietly stayed with you, too. Sometimes the smallest connections leave the biggest impressions.